The command center of Eidolon Station hummed with nervous energy. Rows of holographic displays bathed the room in shifting blue light, each one charting the trajectories of alien fleets converging on Earth. Military officers barked orders, their voices strained as they coordinated planetary defenses. Beyond the reinforced windows, Earth loomed like a fragile jewel, its swirling white clouds and shimmering oceans a stark contrast to the encroaching darkness of the Tovak Armada. General Elara Vance stood at the center of the room, her gaze fixed on the primary display. The Tovak's serrated ships moved with terrifying precision, weaving through humanity's scattered defenses as if mocking their attempts at resistance. Their intent was clear: Earth would fall, and with it, humanity's tenuous place among the stars. "We're out of time," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the cacophony. Around her, the room fell silent. All eyes turned to the figure standing in the corner, a man whose disheveled appearance betrayed weeks of sleepless nights. Dr. Arik Hellstrom, the architect of humanity's most devastating creation, adjusted his glasses and avoided the accusing stares of the officers. "Are you sure about this, Hellstrom?" Vance asked, her tone hard but not unkind. "You said the weapon was experimental. Now you're asking us to risk the future of humanity on it." Hellstrom hesitated, his hands trembling as he pulled up schematics on a nearby console. The thermal cascade device appeared as a glowing model, a sleek cylinder housing unimaginable power. Its design was as elegant as it was destructive, a chain reaction triggered within a planet's core, releasing enough energy to shatter its crust and vaporize everything on its surface. "It will work," Hellstrom said, though his voice lacked conviction. "But the scale. You need to understand, General, this isn't just a weapon. It's annihilation. Nothing survives, not even the memory of what was there." "Good," Vance replied without hesitation. "That's exactly what we need." A murmur spread through the room, unease rippling among the officers and scientists present. The Tovak were monsters, everyone agreed, but the sheer finality of the TCD's power chilled them. Earth's history was littered with tales of hubris, of weapons created to ensure peace only to bring ruin. Yet this time there seemed no alternative. The Tovak had raised entire colonies, enslaved billions, and left no survivors in their wake. Humanity's survival hinged on proving it was not to be underestimated. Vance turned to the operations console. "Activate the TCD." Across the station, alarms blared as the weapon was primed. Deep within the station's core, automated systems came to life. Massive conduits channeled energy into the device, causing the entire structure to vibrate. Hellstrom felt the vibrations in his chest, each pulse a reminder of the horrors about to be unleashed. The targeting systems locked onto Xenothar, the Tovak homeworld. Its green surface gleamed faintly on the display, a world teeming with life and the source of humanity's suffering. As the countdown began, the room grew silent. Even the hum of machinery seemed to fade, replaced by the oppressive weight of what they were about to do. "Fire," Vance ordered. The TCD launched with a burst of energy that momentarily blinded the sensors. The weapon streaked through the void like a shard of burning glass, a streak of light cutting across the darkness. Time seemed to stretch as they watched it disappear from view, its path traced by data streams on the monitors. Minutes passed. Then the first wave of energy hit Xenothar. The planet's surface fractured instantly, massive fissures erupting across its surface. The view was surreal, like watching a god dismantle creation piece by piece. A second wave followed, and the planet's core destabilized, glowing like a second sun before collapsing in on itself. The Tovak fleets orbiting the planet were obliterated, their ships swallowed by expanding waves of fire and debris. The room erupted in cheers, officers and scientists embracing, their relief palpable. Humanity had triumphed against impossible odds. For the first time in months, they allowed themselves to hope. But not everyone shared the jubilation. Hellstrom remained rooted to his spot, staring at the screen with hollow eyes. On the monitor, the remnants of Xenothar drifted in silence, glowing fragments of a world that once harbored life. He felt no triumph, only the crushing weight of what had been done. "We've crossed a line," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the celebrations. "A line we can't ever uncross." Vance approached him, her expression unreadable. "We saved billions of lives today, Hellstrom. You should be proud." He looked at her, his face ashen. "Proud? General, we didn't just destroy a world. We unmade it. What happens when someone decides to do the same to us?" Her silence spoke volumes. The cheers around them began to die down as the enormity of their actions settled over the room. Outside, Earth continued to spin, unaware of the dark shadow now looming over its future. In the cold void of space, amidst the ruins of Xenothar, something stirred. Hidden within the debris, fragments of the planet's surface pulsed faintly, like embers refusing to die. Silent and unseen, the remnants of the Tovak's final contingency drifted, waiting for a chance to awaken. The Resolute cut through the vast expanse of space, its engines humming steadily as it entered the debris field surrounding what was once Xenothar. The destruction left behind by the thermal cascade device was both awe-inspiring and horrifying. Chunks of the planet floated listlessly, some still glowing faintly with residual heat, others coated in frost as the vacuum of space leached the last remnants of warmth. Dr. Arik Hellstrom stared at the wreckage through the observation window, his jaw clenched tight. He had been reluctant to join the mission, but Earth's High Council had left him little choice. The reports coming from the first wave of survey ships had been impossible to ignore. Something was out here, and the scientists needed answers. "Anything on the scanners?" Commander Maren Holt's voice cut through the oppressive silence. She stood at the helm, her posture rigid, eyes fixed on the holographic displays. Holt was a career soldier, her every movement precise and deliberate, but even she couldn't entirely mask the tension in her voice. "Negative," came the reply from one of the bridge crew. "No energy signatures, no movement, just rocks and debris." Hellstrom leaned against the console, his eyes flicking between the displays. "There were survivors from the Orion Dawn, weren't there?" he asked, his tone clipped. "They said they saw something." Holt nodded, her expression grim. "A biological mass. They claimed it was alive, consuming their ship from the inside out. The footage we recovered was inconclusive." "Inconclusive?" Hellstrom repeated, his voice rising slightly. Their ship was torn apart, and the survivors were too traumatized to speak. That's not inconclusive. That's a warning. Holt's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. The Resolute pressed deeper into the debris field, its external lights casting long shadows across the jagged remains of Xynothar. Every creak of the ship's hull, every flicker of the monitors, felt amplified in the oppressive quiet. The crew moved with hushed efficiency, as though speaking too loudly might disturb something unseen. Hours passed. Hellstrom retreated to the lab, where he pored over data from the ship's sensors. The readings were strange, traces of organic material laced with heavy metals and unknown compounds. Whatever this was, it wasn't native to Xynothar. It was something else entirely, something designed to endure. Dr. Hellstrom, we've got something. Holt's voice crackled over the intercom. He rushed back to the bridge, his pulse quickening. When he arrived, the tension in the room was palpable. The main display showed an enormous structure floating amidst the wreckage. It resembled a cluster of crystalline growths, jagged and irregular, with a faint bioluminescent glow emanating from its surface. "That's no debris," Holt said, her hand resting on the hilt of her sidearm. "It's alive." Hellstrom stared, transfixed. The structure pulsed rhythmically like a heartbeat, and tendrils of organic material drifted outward, intertwining with the surrounding fragments of rock and metal. "It's growing," he murmured, "feeding off the debris." Before anyone could respond, the ship shuddered violently. Alarms blared as the crew scrambled to their stations. "Status report," Holt barked. "Something's on the hull," a technician shouted. "It latched onto us, organic material spreading across the exterior." Hellstrom rushed to a monitor displaying a live feed from the ship's exterior. The sight made his stomach churn. The same glowing tendrils they had observed on the structure were now crawling across the Resolute, fusing with its surface. The metal of the hull seemed to liquefy where the tendrils touched, melding into the alien biomass. "It's trying to absorb the ship," Hellstrom said, his voice trembling. "We need to get out of here. Now!" "Full reverse," Holt ordered, but the ship didn't respond. The tendrils had infiltrated the engines, their bioluminescent glow flickering through the corridors like ghostly veins. And then, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, barely audible beneath the blare of alarms, but as the tendrils spread, the whispers grew louder, weaving through the ship like an insidious melody. The crew froze, their eyes darting nervously as they strained to make out the words. It was a language none of them recognized, yet it scratched at the edges of their understanding, like a half-forgotten memory. "Do you hear that?" one of the engineers whispered, his voice trembling. "It's speaking." Hellstrom felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that the whispers seemed to emanate from nowhere, or the growing realization that they were directed at him. The ship shuddered again, and the lights flickered. One by one, the monitors went dark, replaced by the faint, rhythmic glow of the alien tendrils. Holt drew her weapon, her gaze darting between the crew. "Everyone stay sharp," she said, though her voice betrayed her fear. Suddenly, a scream echoed through the bridge. One of the crew members collapsed, clutching his head. His skin began to darken, veins bulging and writhing beneath the surface as though something was crawling through them. The transformation was horrifyingly fast. Within moments, he was no longer recognizable, his body a grotesque fusion of human and alien tissue. Hellstrom backed away, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's not just feeding," he said. "It's assimilating." Holt fired her weapon, the sharp crack of the shot ringing through the bridge. The infected crew member crumpled to the floor, but even in death, his body continued to mutate, tendrils sprouting from his remains and reaching for the nearest console. "We're getting out of here," Holt said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Dr. Hellstrom, find a way to slow this thing down. Everyone else, prepare for emergency evacuation." As the crew scrambled to execute her orders, the whispers grew louder, their tone shifting from seductive to menacing. The alien entity was no longer content to infiltrate the ship, it was hunting them. Hellstrom stared at the tendrils writhing on the monitors, a sinking feeling settling in his chest. They were no longer explorers. They were prey. The Resolute was dying. The alien biomass, now dubbed the Bloom by the crew, had penetrated every level of the ship. What had started as thin, glowing tendrils wrapping around the hull had become a full-scale infestation. Walls pulsed as if alive, metal warped into organic shapes, and faint, guttural sounds echoed through the corridors like the breathing of some great, unseen beast. The air was thick with the metallic tang of ozone and decay, making every breath a struggle. Dr. Arik Hellstrom sat in the corner of the lab, staring at his hand. A faint discoloration marbled the skin on his wrist, branching outward in jagged lines like cracks in glass. It itched terribly, but scratching only made it worse. He wasn't sure how long he had before the infection reached critical mass. Hours, maybe less. Around him, equipment sparked and failed, overtaken by the relentless spread of the bloom. On the other side of the lab, Commander Maren Holt stood with her arms crossed, her expression grim. She had been the first to notice the bloom's secondary threat, its ability to exploit and manipulate the infected. The crew members who had fallen to the entity weren't just victims, they were tools. They moved with uncanny precision, sabotaging the ship and herding survivors into dead ends where the bloom waited. "They're still in there," Hellstrom muttered, his voice hollow. "The people we lost. The bloom doesn't kill them outright, it integrates them. Their bodies are just vessels now." Holt's jaw tightened. "Then we'll put them out of their misery," she said, her voice hard as steel. "Whatever it takes, this thing doesn't reach Earth." Hellstrom didn't reply. He was too focused on the monitors displaying the ship's interior. The bloom had transformed the Resolute into a grotesque labyrinth, its tendrils spreading faster than they could contain. The reactor room was already compromised, the core glowing faintly beneath a web of alien filaments. If they didn't act soon, the bloom would reach the ship's power systems and fully assimilate the Resolute, and with it, every remaining crew member. A sudden scream shattered the uneasy silence. Holt spun toward the door, her weapon drawn. "Stay here," she ordered Hellstrom before stepping into the corridor. The scream had come from the engineering deck a few levels below. Holt moved quickly, her boots echoing against the floor. The ship's once sterile corridors were now unrecognizable, their surfaces warped and glistening. The lights flickered erratically, casting unsettling shadows that seemed to move on their own. The whispers that had plagued the crew earlier were louder now, overlapping into an eerie cacophony. She found the source of the scream near the engine room. Ensign Torres, one of the few uninfected crew members left, was pinned against the wall. Tendrils had wrapped around his torso, pulling him into a pulsing mass of bloom that had overtaken the floor. His eyes met Holt's, wide with terror. "Help me," he cried, his voice raw and desperate. Holt raised her weapon, hesitating for only a moment before firing. The shot hit Torres in the chest, silencing his screams. The bloom retracted slightly, as though recoiling from the damage, but it didn't stop. Tendrils continued to writhe, absorbing what was left of the ensign's body. She clenched her jaw, turning away from the sight. Every death was another weight on her conscience, but there was no time for hesitation. The bloom was learning, adapting. Every second they delayed gave it more time to grow. By the time Holt returned to the lab, Hellstrom had made a grim discovery. He pointed to the data scrolling across a damaged monitor, his hands shaking. "The bloom isn't just feeding on the ship," he said. "It's using the reactor's energy to accelerate its growth. If it fully integrates with the core, it'll trigger a chain reaction, an explosion powerful enough to launch its spores across the entire sector." "How long do we have?" Holt demanded. "Minutes," Hellstrom replied. "Maybe less. We need to destroy the reactor before it happens." Holt didn't hesitate. "We evacuate the survivors first. Get them to the escape pods." Hellstrom shook his head. "There aren't enough pods for everyone, and even if there were, the bloom is already on the hull. It'll follow us. We have to stop it here." The weight of his words hung heavily in the air. Holt nodded slowly, her expression hardening. "Then we do it the hard way." The journey to the reactor was a nightmare. The corridors were filled with infected crew members, their twisted forms barely recognizable. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, as though controlled by invisible strings. Some reached out to Holt and Hellstrom as they passed, their faces contorted in expressions of pain and rage. Hellstrom tried not to look, but the whispers were impossible to ignore. They called his name, taunting him, begging him to join them. "Keep moving," Holt barked, her weapon blazing as she cleared a path through the swarm. They reached the reactor room with seconds to spare. The bloom had already consumed most of the machinery, its tendrils pulsing with energy. Hellstrom ran to the control panel, his fingers flying over the keys as he initiated the overload sequence. "It's done," he said, his voice trembling. "We've got 2 minutes before the reactor goes critical." Holt nodded, her gaze sweeping the room. The bloom was closing in, its tendrils writhing hungrily toward them. "Go," she ordered. "Get to the escape pods." Hellstrom hesitated. "What about you?" She met his eyes, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Someone has to make sure it doesn't stop the countdown." Before he could argue, she shoved him toward the door. "Go!" Hellstrom ran, his chest heaving as he sprinted through the bloom-infested corridors. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but he forced himself to ignore them. When he reached the escape pods, he climbed into the last one and sealed the hatch. As the pod launched, he caught one last glimpse of the Resolute. Through the viewport, he saw the ship's silhouette against the void, its once pristine form now a twisted amalgamation of metal and organic matter. And then, in a blinding flash, the reactor detonated, consuming the ship in a fiery explosion. Hellstrom closed his eyes, the screams of the infected crew echoing in his mind. He had escaped, but he knew the bloom wasn't gone. Not entirely. Somewhere in the vastness of space, fragments of it still drifted, silent, patient, and hungry. The escape pod drifted silently through the void, its metal shell battered and scorched from the blast that had consumed the Resolute. Dr. Arik Hellstrom sat slumped in the cramped cabin, his hands trembling in his lap. Outside the porthole, the dying embers of the explosion flickered like distant stars, fading one by one into the endless darkness. He should have felt relief, but there was none. The silence was too loud, the absence of the whispers almost worse than their presence. His breath came in shallow gasps, the stale, recycled air tasting like ash in his throat. He wiped at his face, only to realize his hands were damp with tears. Maren Holt was gone. The others were gone. He had fled, leaving her behind to finish what they'd started. She had bought him this moment, this slim chance to warn Earth, but the cost was unbearable. A soft chime broke the silence as the pod's computer came to life. Proximity alert. Debris detected. Hellstrom straightened, his heart lurching. He peered out the window, his blood turning to ice. At first, it seemed like nothing, just the remnants of the Resolute, fragments of metal and organic matter scattering outward. But then he saw it, a single tendril of the bloom drifting lazily through the void. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it pulsed faintly with life. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It can't be." The pod's computer chimed again. Organic material detected. Analyzing. Hellstrom's hands moved instinctively to the controls, trying to steer the pod away from the debris. But it was too late. The tendril brushed against the hull, its bioluminescent glow spreading like a stain. Within seconds, the cabin lights flickered, and the whispering began again. A faint, mocking sound that sent shivers down his spine. "System compromised," the computer announced, its voice distorted. "Manual override required." Hellstrom scrambled to the console, his fingers flying over the controls, but the pod's systems were already failing. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a maddening chorus. He clutched at his head, his nails digging into his scalp as he tried to block them out. "Stop!" he shouted. "Leave me alone!" But the bloom didn't stop. It was inside now, spreading through the pod systems, crawling closer with every passing moment. Hellstrom's vision blurred, his thoughts fracturing under the weight of the whispers. They weren't just sounds. They were voices, familiar and haunting. He heard Holt's voice among them, clear and piercing. "You can't run from this," she said. "You know what you have to do." He blinked, his breath hitching. His trembling hands reached for the emergency panel beneath the console, pulling it open to reveal a manual release for the pod's life support systems. If he purged the oxygen, the pod would go dark. The bloom's spread halted by the vacuum of space. But it would also mean his death. "You have a choice," the whispers taunted. "Join us. Become more." Tears streamed down his face as he stared at the panel. His hand hovered over the lever, his mind racing. He thought of Earth, of the billions of lives hanging in the balance. He thought of Holt. Her final smile burned into his memory. He thought of the bloom, its insatiable hunger, its promise of something worse than death. "I'm sorry," he whispered, to no one and everyone. With a trembling breath, he pulled the lever. The hiss of escaping air filled the cabin, and the temperature plummeted. Hellstrom gasped, his lungs burning as the oxygen thinned. The lights flickered one last time before going out, plunging the pod into darkness. The whispers faded, replaced by the cold, indifferent silence of the void. As his vision dimmed, Hellstrom felt a strange sense of peace. The bloom's tendrils recoiled, unable to survive in the oxygenless vacuum. His sacrifice had bought Earth a little more time. Maybe it was enough. His last thought was of Holt, her voice clear in his mind. "You did what you had to do," she said, and for the first time he believed it. The pod drifted aimlessly, its systems cold and lifeless. Inside, Hellstrom's body slumped against the console, frost creeping across his skin. Outside, the bloom's fragment floated inert, its faint glow extinguished. But in the endless void of space, a fragment of the bloom lingered. It clung to a piece of debris, carried on the faint current of solar winds, drifting ever closer to an unknowing Earth.